Hello, ladies and gentlemen. They invited me a couple of years ago to come and speak on Birds and People, and on that occasion I spoke on one species and I overran my time limit. Today I'm going to talk about all 10,500, so I hope you're not hungry. The book is a collaboration, very much a collaboration between an international publisher, Random House, and with an international environmental organization, BirdLife International. It's also a collaboration between myself and a photographer, David Tipling. And I have myself in black and white because I think he had an easy life. He traveled in 39 countries on 7 continents, swanning around, taking fantastic pictures of birds. I sat at that desk for 5 years, talking to the world on the internet. And he tells me I had it easy, but I think he had the easier job. In truth, we both worked extremely hard. I literally took me 5 years, 400,000 words. And the book is unusual because instead of trying to tell you, most bird books tell you about, most bird books are about birds. They're about their biology and their behavior. My book is about people. It's much more interesting. And it's about 2 real ways in which birds affect us. It's about the practical ways that birds permeate our lives. The most important source of protein on the planet is chickens. There are, we eat 90 million tons of chicken. And turkeys, 250 to 300 million turkeys eaten by the Americans. The French produce, I think it's 300 million ducks, and they control per annum, and they control 4% of the world market. The major producers are the Chinese. And so birds are absolutely fundamental, systemic to the world economy and to our source of food, but they're also important in another way, and they allow us to think about life. And I want to show you the 2 fundamental, very separate ways in which birds affect us. Here's a lovely picture of a chicken. The chicken also gave me my name. I think there's a case of nominative determinism here. But the breeder of cocks in the days of chicken cockfighting was known as a cocker. And it is our most important bird. At any one time on the planet, there are 12 billion chickens. I calculate that there are probably somewhere in the region of 30 to 50 billion chickens on the earth every year. They're all in a constant cycle, 6-week cycle from birth to death, and produce, as I say, 90 million tons of chicken, 57 million tons of eggs. In any hour of any day, the British eat 1 million eggs, and the Americans eat 1 million chickens every hour. So you get a sense of how significant this is. I'd like to tell you that most of the birds you're eating lived a life like this lovely little family here. In fact, most of them spend their lives on a size of the earth that's that big. So our single most important bird is treated in the most abominable way, and the single most important environmental act or kind of care for birds is to eat free-range chicken and free-range eggs. Here's a classic example of how we treat the birds. This is a New Delhi chicken delivery man. Now, this is a carbon-neutral form of chicken delivery, but it gives you pretty much the idea of how we treat them. It is pretty appalling. I don't want you to feel bad when you have your chicken for dinner, but think about them. And here's another shot David took in Iquitos in the Peruvian Amazon. Actually, I quite approve of this lady because she's eating absolutely everything, the feet, the head, the whole works. But I also want to talk about birds being good to think, and that's a slightly more complex picture. But I'm going to talk about them in the context of hummingbirds. Hummingbirds are some of the most extraordinary living creatures on the planet. This is called a booted racquet-tail. They're not only incredibly beautiful, they have these amazing glittering whiskers or great shields of color in front of them, metallic color. Many of them have extraordinary names, some of my favorite being tourmaline, sun angel, and lazuli saberwing. And the naturalists that gave them these names clearly were poets of a high order. But the extraordinary thing about hummingbirds is their biometrics and their biology. They are some of the smallest birds, are the smallest vertebrate life on the planet. The heaviest is called the giant hummingbird. It weighs less than 3/4 of an ounce. Something like this probably weighs about 2 grams. Their heartbeat is up to 20 times per second. They have this extraordinary metabolism where they literally live on the edge of starvation all the time. And they carry vertebrate life to its absolute edge, to the edge. I mean, as I say, if they don't find these 2,000 flowers a day, hummingbirds will die if they can't find their food. They also have this extraordinary flight. They can fly forwards, backwards, they can fly up or down, or they can hover completely stationary, or they can flip over backwards, right over. The wings beat at an average of 70 to 80 times per second. The slowest, the giant, I love it, the giant hummingbird, its wings beat only at 20 times per second. But in some display flights, the hummingbird can fly at 200, the wings can beat 200 times per second. So it's an incredible bird, loaded with a significance about life, vertebrate life, as I say, being carried to one of the great frontiers of what is possible. They're breathing, they breathe, I think their blood pumps around the body 100 times faster than humans. I'm kind of blinding you with the statistics, but I want to get across that hummingbirds are amazing. I hope you've got that point. But what I find powerful about them is the way in which they kind of articulate things about life, and I'm going to use a number of examples from Native America. The most interesting is a group of people called the O'odham. They were once called the Pima People, but I think that was insulting, but O'odham is as close as I can get. Anyway, the O'odham was starving, suffering a terrible fate, and a hummingbird came along and he threw a little slender twine, and he hooked the wind and the rain. They were hiding in a cave, as they do in Norfolk. I don't know if they do here, but they were hiding in a cave. And the hummingbird dragged them out of the cave and took them to the supplicant O'odham people who were starving because they had no rain to grow their crops. And the hummingbird promised that he would always bring the wind and rain in spring. And so the Pima or O'odham people had an enormous affection for hummingbirds. They were embedded in native stories from across the entire range. Hummingbirds are entirely American birds, occur almost from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego. And this idea of the birds being somehow loaded with life in a way that most things are not is quite extraordinary. The stories are aligned to suggest how the birds are bringers of extremely precious human gifts. As in the case of the O'odham, it's the rain and the wind. Very often for the Pueblo Indians, the Zuni and the Hopi, they came and brought the spring. They were associated fundamentally with springtime. For the Navajo, they were associated with that extraordinary corn that they grow in these dry crop situations in southwest USA. So, the fundamentals of life, corn, rain, spring. This is a scintillant hummingbird, I think, from Ecuador. Another story which is very powerful is of hummingbirds being bringers of tobacco. Now, tobacco is not the grotesque carcinogen that you have all spurned, I know, in your private lives. It was a reverent, sacred crop that enabled the shamans to get really high and experience that great rush that tobacco induces. And so it was a plant framed by ritual. It was not used in a vulgar way. It was very sacred, and hummingbirds were often associated for the Carib people, for the Warao, and even in the northern range of Nicotiana plants, the Cherokee, also saw the hummingbird as a bringer of this extremely precious gift. In fact, in the Pueblo Indians, the sacred ceremonies that they would perform to kind of induce the wind and the rain to come in spring would involve blowing tobacco to the 4 directions of the earth. So it was a very precious plant. It was not something forsaken and debased as it has become in the West. And the most moving story for me is of the Mojave Indians who have this origin myth about where they came from. Very interesting sort of metaphoric language. They were deep in the bowels of the earth. and they were in the darkness, and a hummingbird came and led them out into the sunlit uplands of the southwest USA. So the hummingbird is associated with light itself. I mean, even more extraordinary are the 5 minutes, okay. I'm going to bring it in on time, don't worry. Yes, for the Aztecs, it was associated with the killing of warriors, those people who had their hearts ripped out on those temple tops in Tenochtitlan were thought to come back as hummingbirds. And this seems to be a sort of forsaken, dark, macabre association with the birds. But actually one of the tasks of these warriors hummingbirds in the afterlife was to wrestle with the powers of darkness with Huitzilopochtli, who was the central deity of the Mexica or the Aztecs. And every morning the hummingbirds would go out with Huitzilopochtli to fight the forces of darkness, to restore light to the earth. So you can see how, in a way, how the biological information that we have from science aligns with the idea that these birds are rich in life in a way that very few things are, and therefore are the things most endowed to invest human experience with precious gifts. And I think that they show how we are able to access ideas about life itself, about ourselves, about experience. And although these are modern Western portrayals of how hummingbirds become part of our lives, classic pieces of behavior in Central and South America and North America is to feed hummingbirds. And if anybody has ever seen it, if anybody's ever been to Trinidad, it's astonishing, these tiny little things buzzing in your face. They're extraordinary, very often associated with aggression. Because they're so fierce, they're starving, essentially. They stand at the brink of starvation, and so feeding is very important for them. And I remember once going to a house in Arizona where a very old lady and old man had got their house festooned in these hummingbird feeders, and anybody was allowed to go into their garden. I mean, I just wandered into their garden. They had a deck chair for me where I could sit down, and the house was surrounded by this kind of penumbra of intense little birds all feeding on these feeders. And this wonderful act of Christian charity by this wonderful couple, allowing anybody to come in to share these hummingbirds with them. And I think that was in a way moves towards the kind of ideas we find embedded in these Native American stories. These are Rufus hummingbirds in Ecuador. Ecuador, one of the highest diversities of hummingbirds, 132 species, but there are about 430 worldwide. And I just want to let you, David, because all the photographs are his, it has to be said. He's here in spirit. All these fantastic photos are his, but he took this lovely little piece of footage of hummingbirds, which we're going to show you now, Daisy, if you hit the button. Yeah, I'm actually brought it in earlier, so I haven't talked about all the birds of the world, but I have talked about really just one way in which birds give us access to ideas about experience. Hummingbirds, obviously, remarkable, but there are 10,500 species, all of them in massively different ways, allowing us to access parts of our experience. Try and think of albatrosses or eagles or sparrows. Sparrows are loaded with symbolism. And what the book's trying to say is that if you don't have a really rich ecosystem out there in the world, if we don't preserve the natural environment, we don't have 10,500 birds, all those birds that live within us, all those ideas that we have that come from our encounters with wild animals, they'll die also, and the ecosystem will become like a high street in a middle English town where all the shops are exactly the same. It'll be a monoculture, and it's about the way in which the natural environment provides us with a mainspring of our cultural life. Thank you very much.